Arrogant billionaire refuses to stand for black judge. Her next move destroys his life forever. The courtroom was packed to the brim, a suffocating tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. Every seat was filled. At the defendant's table, Ethan Grayson sat with an air of detached amusement, his fingers idly flipping through his phone, as if this were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His slicked-back hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his face the perfect mask of indifference. He was the kind of man who had spent his life believing that laws were mere suggestions, obstacles meant to be sidestepped with money, power, and influence. The murmurs around the room hushed as the bailiff's voice rang out, firm and commanding. All rise for the Honorable Judge Monica Lee. A collective shuffle followed as the entire courtroom obeyed. Chairs scraped against the polished wooden floors. Journalists stood with hurried precision. Victims straightened their weary backs. And even the prosecution attorneys rose to their feet with due respect. Everyone stood, except one. Ethan Grayson remained seated, his eyes still fixated on his phone, scrolling with the casual air of a man checking stock prices, entirely indifferent to the authority now towering over him. A weighted silence filled the room, the kind that stretched taut like an unspoken challenge. The audacity of his actions sent ripples of disbelief through the crowd. This was not just arrogance. This was a deliberate display of defiance. It was a statement. I do not acknowledge your authority. You do not matter to me. His lawyer, a seasoned defender of the ultra-rich, leaned in urgently, whispering something under his breath. But Ethan barely acknowledged him, offering nothing more than a lazy flick of his wrist, as if swatting away an irrelevant concern. Judge Monica Lee, standing behind the elevated bench, absorbed the scene with a practiced calm. She was no stranger to men like Ethan Grayson, men who believed their wealth shielded them from consequence, men who had spent their entire lives bending reality to fit their own narratives. She had seen them all, corporate tycoons who manipulated loopholes, politicians who wielded their influence like a weapon, fraudsters who left trails of ruined lives in their wake, all walking into her courtroom with the same unwavering belief that they were untouchable. Her sharp, intelligent eyes locked onto Ethan's figure, but she did not react with outrage. She did not demand compliance or acknowledge the insult with words. Instead, she did something far more unsettling. She simply stared. The silence deepened, pressing against the walls of the courtroom like an unspoken weight. It was as if time had slowed, every second stretching longer as all eyes flickered between the seated billionaire and the unflinching judge. Tension crawled up the spines of those in the room. Some of the victims clenched their fists, their jaws tightening as they witnessed, once again, the blatant entitlement of the man who had destroyed their lives. The journalists, trained to pick up on the subtlest shifts in courtroom dynamics, held their breath, waiting. But Judge Lee remained motionless, her posture a portrait of controlled authority. She did not demand respect. She did not plead for it. She simply stood, letting the weight of the moment settle. The sheer force of her presence, the unwavering steel in her eyes, made it clear that Ethan Grayson's defiance had been noted. A flicker of something crossed Ethan's face. Was it irritation? Mild curiosity? For the first time, he lifted his gaze from his phone, meeting Judge Lee's stare head-on. The smirk he had worn so effortlessly moments ago faltered, just slightly, before he straightened his posture. He was used to people reacting. He was used to control. Yet she did not react. She did not reprimand him, did not grant him the satisfaction of a response. Instead, she simply allowed the silence to drag on. The courtroom remained frozen in that moment, an invisible battle unfolding between two forces, the unshakable power of wealth and the relentless force of justice. Finally, in a voice that was calm, unwavering, and laced with an authority that needed no theatrics, Judge Lee spoke. "You may be seated." The words were simple, but the impact was seismic. She had not demanded his respect, nor had she engaged in his game of provocation. She had simply moved past his defiance, stripping it of the power he had hoped to wield. And in doing so, she had made something clear. His arrogance would not define these proceedings. The courtroom collectively exhaled, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Ethan, however, simply leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other as if nothing had happened. But something had shifted. Though he still exuded confidence, there was a new sharpness in his gaze, a recognition that this trial might not be as effortless as he had once assumed. Judge Lee settled into her seat, adjusting the papers before her with measured precision. "We will begin," she said, her voice smooth yet firm, carrying the weight of a woman who had spent years carving justice into an unjust system. Ethan Grayson had once been hailed as a financial genius, a self-made billionaire who promised prosperity to those who dared to dream. His empire, Grayson Investments, had positioned itself as a beacon of opportunity for middle-class families, struggling entrepreneurs, and retirees looking for financial security. He had built his brand on the illusion of trust, standing in front of cameras, flashing his million-dollar smile, and preaching about the American dream. "Invest in me," he had said, "and I'll invest in your future." And they had believed him. But beneath the glitz and glamour, behind the soaring skyscrapers that bore his name, lay a devastating truth. Ethan Grayson was no visionary. He was a predator. He hadn't built an empire. He had orchestrated a house of cards propped up by the shattered dreams of thousands. The courtroom sat in heavy silence as the prosecution laid out the reality of his crimes. Chart after chart, spreadsheet after spreadsheet, the numbers told a chilling story. Over $2 billion had vanished into the abyss of Ethan Grayson's greed. Retirement funds wiped out, mortgage payments defaulted, college tuition fees stolen in the blink of an eye. Families who had put their faith in him were left destitute, drowning in debts they would never escape. But even as these damning figures flashed across the screens in the courtroom, Ethan remained unfazed. He sat back, arms folded, the corners of his mouth twitching with amusement, as though he were watching a poorly written tragedy unfold before him. Then came the witnesses. Angela Martinez was the first to take the stand, a single mother barely in her 30s, but with eyes that had aged decades from the weight of what she had endured. She had once believed in Ethan Grayson. She had worked tirelessly as a nurse, every paycheck carefully budgeted, every dollar saved to give her children the future they deserved. When Ethan's firm had promised guaranteed returns, a way to multiply her modest savings, she had taken the risk. "It was everything I had," she said, her voice trembling. "My children's college fund, my emergency savings, my retirement, everything." And then, in a blink, it was gone. Angela's hands shook as she recounted the moment she realized the truth. The bank had called, informing her that her mortgage payment had bounced. She had tried to reach out to Grayson Investments, desperate for answers, but the phone lines had gone silent. The offices had been cleared out. The website had disappeared. "I lost my home," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My kids and I lived in our car for 2 weeks before I could find a shelter that had space for us." The courtroom was deathly still, except for Ethan. He scoffed, loudly. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the audience. The prosecutor's jaw tightened. Even the judge's expression darkened. But Ethan didn't care. He leaned back, whispering something to his attorney, shaking his head as if this was all a tedious formality. To him, Angela Martinez was nothing, just another fool who had dared to trust him. Angela swallowed hard, her eyes locking onto his. "Do you think this is funny?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Do you think ruining people's lives is a joke to you?" Ethan merely smirked. Someone in the audience cursed under their breath. The bailiff shot a warning glance, but the damage had been done. The room had reached its boiling point. The next witness was Peter Vaughn, a man who had spent 35 years running into burning buildings, saving lives, giving everything to his community as a firefighter. He had spent his career planning for a retirement that was supposed to be comfortable, secure. Ethan Grayson had stolen that from him. Vaughn took the stand, his broad shoulders squared, but there was something in his expression, a hollow exhaustion, a deep resentment that had festered for too long. He had lost $400,000 in Grayson's scheme, his entire life savings. "I had a plan," he said, his voice low and measured, though the anger simmered beneath it. "I worked hard. I did everything right. And then this man," he turned, jabbing a finger toward Ethan, "burned my future to the ground." Ethan raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Vaughn clenched his fists. His wife had passed away years ago. and without his savings, he had nowhere to go. "I sleep in my brother's guest room now," he continued, his voice thick with restrained fury. "I went from planning vacations with my grandkids to wondering if I'll ever afford my own apartment again." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "And this piece of—" He cut himself off, gripping the edge of the witness stand to steady himself. "This man doesn't care. He never cared." Ethan gave him a long, slow once-over, then tilted his head slightly. "I don't recall forcing you to invest, old man." The room erupted. Shouts of outrage echoed against the walls. Someone yelled for Ethan to rot in hell. Others jeered, voices overlapping in a cacophony of anger, disbelief, and pure, unfiltered hatred. The bailiff pounded his fist on the desk, calling for order. The judge's gavel slammed down with a thunderous crack, demanding silence. Ethan simply smiled. Judge Monica Lee's gaze bore into him, her jaw clenched, her fingers tightening around her gavel as if she were resisting the urge to throw it at his head. "Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice cold as steel, "you will conduct yourself with the respect this court demands." Ethan let out a breathy chuckle. "Respect?" he echoed. "For what? A sob story?" The room froze. Judge Lee inhaled sharply, and for a brief moment, an unspoken storm passed between them. He had crossed a line. As the outrage in the courtroom slowly settled, the weight of Ethan Grayson's callousness still hung heavy in the air. But for Angela Martinez, the nightmare wasn't just about lost money, it was about the future that had been stolen from her child. Angela Martinez's voice cracked as she struggled to finish her sentence, the weight of her anguish pressing down on her like an unbearable force. "My daughter," she whispered, choking back a sob, "was supposed to go to college next year. She had a scholarship, but it wasn't enough to cover everything. That's why I invested. I just wanted to give her a chance." She lifted a trembling hand to wipe her tear-streaked face, her body visibly shaking under the crushing reality of what had been stolen from her. "Now she can't go. I can't even afford to keep a roof over our heads, let alone pay for her education." The courtroom sat in a suffocating silence, the weight of her words settling over everyone like a thick, oppressive fog. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mixture of sorrow and disgust. Even some of the reporters, hardened by years of covering brutal cases, looked shaken. The pain in Angela's voice was raw, unfiltered, a mother's agony, a dream destroyed, a future ripped away. And then from the defense table came a barely audible chuckle. Angela froze mid-sob. So did everyone else. A few heads turned, eyes widening in disbelief, trying to locate the source of the sound. And then Ethan Grayson leaned toward his lawyer, a smirk tugging at the corners of his lips, his voice deliberately low, but not low enough. "I could have taken even more." For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The words, so casual, so indifferent, so utterly cruel, hung in the air like a live wire, crackling with energy, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Then it came. The room erupted in fury. Shouts rang out from every corner. Spectators bolted upright in their seats, their voices overlapping in a chaotic storm of rage and disbelief. Someone in the back slammed a fist against the wooden benches. Another person cursed so loudly that the bailiff spun around, already reaching for control. Victims of Ethan's crimes, men and women who had lost everything, rose to their feet, shaking with rage, pointing at him, screaming words drowned out by the sheer volume of the uproar. Angela, still sitting on the witness stand, was paralyzed, her body rigid, her eyes wide with shock as though she had just been physically struck. She blinked as if trying to process what she had just heard, as if hoping, praying, that she had misheard him. But she hadn't. None of them had. Ethan, meanwhile, didn't flinch, didn't recoil, didn't so much as blink at the fury he had ignited. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, exuding the same lazy arrogance he had carried throughout the trial. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished wood of the table, his expression one of mild amusement, as though watching a particularly entertaining spectacle, as though none of this, not the families he destroyed, not the children whose futures he stole, not the sheer, violent outrage directed at him, mattered. And then, crack! The judge's gavel slammed against the bench, the sharp sound cutting through the chaos like a gunshot. "Order in the court!" Judge Monica Lee's voice rang out, firm, commanding, but laced with something else. Something colder, sharper, deadlier than her usual authority. Rage. The room didn't immediately quiet. The anger was too thick, too consuming to be tamed in an instant. The energy was electric, buzzing beneath the surface, threatening to erupt again the moment someone made another move. Judge Lee slammed the gavel again. Crack. "I said order in the court." This time the room obeyed. Voices fell to harsh whispers, fists slowly unclenched, bodies reluctantly lowered back into their seats. But the rage remained. It simmered beneath the surface, boiling, waiting, festering, ready to ignite again at the slightest provocation. Ethan still wasn't fazed. Judge Lee turned her attention to him, her sharp, piercing gaze finally landing on the man who had sat there, smirking, taunting, reveling in the destruction he had caused. For the first time that day, her mask cracked. She had remained composed throughout the trial, her expression unreadable, her professionalism unshakable. But now she was looking at Ethan Grayson like she wanted to rip him apart. Her grip on the gavel tightened. Her knuckles turned white, her jaw locked, the muscles flexing ever so slightly, as though she was restraining herself from saying what she really wanted to say. Finally, after a long, suffocating pause, she spoke. "Mr. Grayson," she said, and though her voice was measured, it was cold as steel, each word sharp as a blade. "You are dangerously close to being held in contempt of court?" Ethan smirked, feigning innocence. "Did I say something wrong, Your Honor?" A murmur of disgust rippled through the audience. His audacity was unreal. Judge Lee's expression didn't change, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made even the most seasoned attorneys in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. "This is not a game, Mr. Grayson," she continued, her voice low, controlled, but deadly in its precision. "This is a court of law. If you believe that your wealth or status gives you the right to mock this process, let me assure you, you are sorely mistaken." Ethan still didn't blink. Judge Lee leaned forward slightly. "And if you so much as utter another word meant to demean, humiliate, or disrespect this court, or the victims of your crimes, I will personally see to it that you are escorted out of this room in handcuffs." For a brief second, a fraction of a moment, something flickered across Ethan's face. Something subtle, something dangerously close to hesitation. It was gone in an instant, buried beneath the weight of his arrogance. But Judge Lee had seen it. She held his gaze for a second longer, unyielding, unwavering. Then she finally sat back, adjusting the papers before her, regaining her composure. "The prosecution may continue." The spell was broken, but the atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense, electrified, simmering on the verge of an explosion that had only been temporarily contained. Angela Martinez was still shaking. Peter Vaughn, who had been watching from the front row, looked ready to launch himself across the courtroom. The audience sat on edge, waiting, watching, their collective rage palpable. And Ethan? Ethan simply adjusted his cufflinks, settled back into his chair, and smiled. But the real turning point came when the prosecution unveiled the evidence that would shatter any remaining illusion of Ethan Grayson's innocence. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as the prosecutor stepped forward, a single USB drive pinched between her fingers. The weight of the moment settled over the room, the restless murmurs dying down as she walked toward the evidence table. Every eye in the courtroom followed her movements, victims leaning forward, their breath held in a fragile mix of hope and dread, journalists gripping their pens as if ready to immortalize what was about to unfold. Ethan Grayson, however, remained unaffected. He adjusted his cufflinks, glanced at his watch, and exhaled slowly, as though growing impatient with the spectacle around him. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. "Your Honor," she began, her voice sharp and precise, "the prosecution presents Exhibit 47, a recorded conversation between the defendant and his executive team, discussing fraudulent activities within Grayson Investments." She inserted the USB into the court's speaker system. A crackle of static filled the room before a voice. smooth, controlled, laced with unmistakable arrogance, cut through the silence. Make the numbers look good. We need these puppets to sign. The effect was immediate. A chilling wave swept through the courtroom. Angela Martinez clasped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Peter Vaughn stiffened in his seat, his jaw tightening as his knuckles turned white against the wooden bench. A woman in the second row let out a broken sob, quickly muffled by the weight of the moment. Others whispered in disbelief, their murmurs like a rising tide of suppressed fury. But Ethan? Ethan smirked. He tilted his head slightly, as if curious to hear his own voice being played back to him. The recording continued, every word laced with the soulless calculation of a man who had seen people as mere numbers, lives as nothing more than disposable assets in his grand scheme. People don't need to know the truth. They just need to believe what we tell them. If they lose their money, that's their problem, not ours. The room was frozen, the weight of those words sinking in like a slow-acting poison. A retired couple in the front row, who had lost everything to Ethan's schemes, exchanged a look, one filled with helpless rage. A young man clenched his fist so tightly his nails dug into his palms, his father having taken his own life after losing their family business. The recording ended with a final, damning statement. "It's just business." For a moment, silence reigned. Then all at once, the courtroom erupted. Shouts of outrage, gasps of horror. A woman's voice broke through the chaos, trembling with grief. "You ruined us!" Another man in the back shouted, "How can you just sit there?" The bailiff pounded his fist against the stand, demanding order. Judge Monica Lee slammed her gavel down once, twice, 3 times. Crack, crack, crack. "Order!" Her voice cut through the fury, sharp as a blade. Slowly the shouting dulled into murmurs, but the rage remained. She turned to the prosecution. "Proceed." The prosecutor nodded, then turned toward Ethan, her eyes narrowing with controlled fire. She took a step closer, placing both hands on the evidence table. "Mr. Grayson," she said slowly, enunciating each syllable with deliberate precision. "Do you recognize this voice?" A beat of silence. Then Ethan Grayson did something that sent another shockwave through the room. He leaned back in his chair, crossed one leg over the other, and laughed. It wasn't a nervous chuckle, nor was it one of disbelief. It was genuine amusement. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head as he tapped a finger against his knee. Then he met the prosecutor's gaze, his smirk widening. "Yeah," he said lazily, as if this entire trial was nothing more than an inconvenience. "That's me. So what?" Another explosion of disbelief rippled through the crowd, held back only by the judge's icy glare. The prosecutor inhaled deeply, as if restraining the urge to launch herself across the table. Instead, she turned toward the jury, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You heard it yourself. Mr. Grayson admits to the voice on that tape. He doesn't deny it. He doesn't even attempt to excuse it. Because in his mind, there is nothing to excuse. To him, ruining thousands of lives, stealing billions of dollars, manipulating the people who trusted him, was just business." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on!" Judge Lee's head snapped toward him, her face a mask of cold authority. "Mr. Grayson, I suggest you choose your next words carefully." Ethan grinned. "Or what? You'll give me a stern lecture?" He spread his hands mockingly. "I admitted it. So what's next, Judge? A slap on the wrist?" A deathly silence settled over the room. Judge Lee's expression remained unreadable, but her grip on the gavel tightened. Then she leaned forward slightly, and when she spoke, her voice was calm. Too calm. "I'll tell you what's next right now, Mr. Grayson." With all evidence laid bare and no more room for deception, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Ethan Grayson was about to face the full weight of the law. The courtroom was silent, suffocating under the weight of what was about to happen. Every pair of eyes was locked on Judge Monica Lee as she sat at the bench, her expression composed, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood in front of her. The air was thick with anticipation, with fear, with the quiet, simmering rage of the people who had been wronged. Ethan Grayson, however, sat stiffly at the defense table, his usual smug demeanor replaced by something colder, more alert. For the first time since the trial began, There was an edge of uncertainty in his gaze. He had spent months delaying, maneuvering, manipulating. He had spent years believing that the system would never touch him. He was about to learn otherwise. Judge Lee lifted the verdict documents, her voice unwavering as she read, "Ethan Grayson, you have been found guilty on all counts." A ripple of tension ran through the courtroom. The victims held their breath. Ethan's jaw tightened. Judge Lee continued, her tone measured, unwavering. "Fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, obstruction of justice." She set the papers down with deliberate precision. "Your crimes were not acts of carelessness, nor were they victimless. You exploited thousands of innocent people for your own gain. You orchestrated one of the largest financial scams in recent history and showed not even the faintest sign of remorse." Ethan shifted, gripping the edge of the defense table, his fingers pressing hard against the smooth surface. His lips parted slightly as if he was about to interject, but he didn't. Judge Lee exhaled slowly, then delivered the words that sent a shockwave through the room. "You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole." For the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson felt fear. A gasp rippled through the gallery. The victims let out a collective exhale, some clutching each other, others covering their mouths as tears welled in their eyes. Angela Martinez's hands trembled as she gripped the armrest of her chair, her body rigid with overwhelming emotion. Peter Vaughn clenched his fists, his breathing shallow, his shoulders shaking as the weight of justice, real justice, finally settled in. But Ethan, his mind reeled. This wasn't possible. This was not how it was supposed to go. His pulse hammered against his skull. His entire body tensed as his breathing grew erratic, shallow, like a caged animal, realizing too late that the door had locked behind him. Judge Lee's voice cut through his spiraling panic. "Furthermore, the court orders the immediate liquidation of all your assets. Every dollar you stole will be returned to the victims of your crimes." That was when something inside Ethan snapped. His chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet. His face, once a careful mask of arrogance, contorted into a snarl. "No!" His voice was low at first, sharp with disbelief, then louder. "No, you can't do this to me!" The bailiffs took a step forward, bracing for the inevitable. Ethan's breath came in ragged bursts, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes darted frantically around the room as if searching for someone, anyone, who would intervene, who would tell him this was some kind of mistake. Then his fury boiled over. His voice thundered through the courtroom, raw and wild with desperation. "I am the system." The words echoed like a war cry, reverberating against the high ceilings, ringing in the ears of everyone present. The sheer audacity of it sent a fresh wave of shock through the crowd. Angela Martinez flinched. Peter Vaughn shook his head, disgust twisting his features. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing the moment that would make headlines by morning. Ethan slammed his hands against the table. "I built this world," he spat, his voice shaking with unhinged rage. "I built the goddamn economy you all live in. You think you can tear me down? You need me." Judge Lee did not flinch. She did not react. She simply held his gaze, her expression steady, her authority unshakable. Then, with quiet finality, she spoke. "You may have been part of the system, Mr. Grayson, but you were never above it." Ethan's nostrils flared, his chest heaving as if the oxygen in the room had suddenly become scarce. Judge Lee's gaze sharpened, her words slow, deliberate, piercing. "And now you will face the consequences of your actions?" The command was unspoken, but immediate. The bailiffs moved. Ethan barely had time to react before strong hands clamped onto his arms, yanking them behind his back. The cold bite of steel pressed against his wrists as the handcuffs locked into place. A new kind of panic flickered in his eyes. Something different than anger, something closer to realization. This was happening. His breath came out ragged, his pulse roaring in his ears. He tried to jerk away, but the bailiffs held firm. He wasn't in control anymore. The courtroom erupted in applause. Some of the victims sobbed openly, others cheered, their voices shaking with years of pent-up rage, grief, and injustice finally avenged. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, camera shutters clicking furiously. Angela Martinez clutched her chest, her entire body trembling as she allowed herself for the first time in years to believe that justice was real. Peter Vaughn exhaled a long, shuddering breath. He didn't smile, didn't cheer. He just sat there, letting the reality sink in. Ethan, still held tightly by the bailiffs, thrashed. His breath came in desperate gasps now, no longer the controlled arrogance he had carried like armor throughout the trial. "This isn't over," he roared, his voice ragged, cracking. "I'll appeal this. I'll have your career ruined, Judge. Do you hear me? I'll own you." Judge Lee simply closed the case file in front of her. She did not respond, because there was nothing left to say. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The bailiffs dragged Ethan toward them, his body still fighting, his voice still spitting venom. But the walls of his empire had already collapsed around him. He had spent a lifetime weaving the illusion that he was invincible. That illusion had been shattered. Judge Lee straightened, adjusting her robe. "This court is adjourned," she declared, her voice steady, unwavering. She lifted the gavel one final time. Crack. The sound echoed through the courtroom, sealing Ethan Grayson's fate. And just like that, the man who had once ruled the financial world was gone. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The courtroom had delivered its verdict. The gavel had fallen, and Ethan Grayson had been led away in chains. But beyond the heavy wooden doors of justice, a different kind of battle was only just beginning. The world outside was not a place where justice reigned supreme. It was a battlefield of influence, power, and control, where narratives could be reshaped and truth was just another commodity to be bought and sold. The public response was immediate and explosive. Social media platforms were flooded with reactions, news stations aired back-to-back coverage, and the country seemed split in two. For the thousands of victims who had lost their homes, their savings, and their futures, it was a moment of long-awaited justice. Angela Martinez, still reeling from the weight of the verdict, spoke to reporters outside the courthouse, her voice hoarse with emotion. "For years, I thought people like him never had to pay for what they did to us. But today, I finally feel like we matter." Peter Vaughn, the retired firefighter who had testified against Ethan, simply nodded when approached for comment. "It doesn't give me back what I lost," he admitted, "but at least now he knows what it feels like to have his future ripped away." On the other side of the divide, however, a different narrative was taking shape. Ethan Grayson was not without powerful allies. He had spent years cultivating relationships with politicians, media moguls, and corporate leaders, the kind of people who thrived on the same corruption he had embodied. They weren't just going to let him fall without a fight. Within hours of the sentencing, major news networks with ties to Grayson Investments began spinning the counterattack. Headlines flashed across screens, carefully crafted talking points dripping with manipulation. Unprecedented punishment for a business leader. Is this justice or a witch hunt? Judge Lee's controversial ruling sparks debate. Was she too harsh? Selective prosecution? Why some believe Ethan Grayson is a political scapegoat. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't about the people he had robbed blind, the families he had destroyed, or the trail of financial devastation he had left behind. It was about him, the supposed victim of an overreaching justice system. Talk show panels debated whether the sentencing was politically motivated. Anchors with perfectly curated outrage asked if a white-collar criminal really deserved 25 years behind bars when hardened criminals often received less. Commentators sneered about Judge Monica Lee's so-called bias, implying, without evidence, that her background and identity had played a role in the severity of the sentencing. She had an agenda, one political analyst argued on a primetime news show. We need to ask ourselves whether this was about justice or about making an example out of a successful businessman. The campaign to rewrite reality had begun. Ethan's most loyal allies launched an aggressive public relations push. Billionaire donors, lobbyists, and corporate strategists flooded the media with carefully crafted messaging. Political figures who had once quietly benefited from his donations now loudly condemned the verdict. This is an attack on free enterprise, one senator declared, standing in front of a podium, cameras flashing. If they can do this to Ethan Grayson, they can do this to any one of us. Online, the debate turned vicious. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Anonymous accounts and bot networks flooded comment sections, questioning the legitimacy of the trial, claiming evidence was fabricated, insisting that Grayson was being punished for being successful. Fake stories emerged, alleging that some victims had lied, that the jury had been pressured, that the government had orchestrated the entire thing to make an example out of him. Judge Monica Lee became a target. Her past cases were scrutinized, her judicial record dissected, every ruling she had ever made twisted into some larger conspiracy. Photos of her personal life were plastered across social media, accusations flying that she had been handpicked to take down Grayson. A video clip of her simply walking into the courthouse was edited and circulated with the caption, "Does this look like a neutral judge or someone with an agenda?" Threats flooded her inbox, death threats, hate mail, anonymous messages dripping with racism and misogyny, all aimed at undermining her authority. The pressure was relentless. The justice system had done its job, but the machine of influence and corruption wasn't finished yet. Meanwhile, inside his high-security detention facility, Ethan Grayson sat in his cell, watching the news play on the small television mounted to the wall. His lips curled into the faintest smirk. They were fighting for him. The people he had made rich, the politicians he had bought, the journalists who owed him favors. They were all working tirelessly to reshape the truth, to cast him as the victim, to set the stage for his return. And Ethan, despite the cold concrete walls around him, despite the steel bars that now separated him from the world he had once controlled, knew one thing for certain. He wasn't finished yet. His lawyers were already working around the clock, filing appeals, exploiting every possible loophole. His PR team was laying the groundwork for a public campaign to push for clemency, early release, or at the very least, a reduced sentence. And if history had proven anything, it was that money had a way of bending even the strongest pillars of justice. In a world where power dictated reality, how long would justice truly last? Judge Monica Lee knew this was only the beginning. As she stepped out of the courthouse under the blinding glare of the press cameras, she could already hear the whispers of doubt, see the seeds of misinformation taking root. Justice had been served, but now it had to be defended. But delivering justice to the powerful always comes with consequences. And for Judge Monica Lee, the real fight was just beginning. The threats started almost immediately after the verdict. At first, they came in the form of anonymous emails, short, venomous messages dripping with barely contained rage. "You've ruined a great man's life. You don't deserve that bench. Watch your back." But within days, they escalated. Letters, some neatly typed, others scrawled in frantic handwriting, began arriving at Judge Monica Lee's office. Some were crude insults, calling her every name imaginable. Others carried chilling warnings, subtle but unmistakable. "You think this is over? You'll regret this. Accidents happen every day." Her clerk, a young woman with sharp eyes and a steady hand, hesitated before handing over the latest batch. "Judge, maybe we should have security screen these first," she suggested. Judge Lee only nodded, flipping through the stack with an impassive expression. She had known this would happen. Her ruling had shaken powerful people, men who weren't used to losing, men who had built their lives around the belief that money could buy them immunity. By sentencing Ethan Grayson to 25 years without parole, she had done the one thing they thought impossible. She had proven that even the rich could fall, and for that, she had become their enemy. But she would not back down. The media was no kinder. The scrutiny was relentless, the pressure unrelenting. Every move she made was analyzed, dissected, twisted into some fabricated agenda. Conservative outlets labeled her as a rogue judge, an activist in robes who had made an example out of Grayson for political reasons. The more radical voices accused her of being biased against the wealthy, of using the courtroom as a weapon for class warfare. Others took a different approach. They didn't attack her ruling outright. Instead, they attacked her. Her past cases were dragged into the spotlight, her legal record scrutinized with surgical precision, desperate for any misstep, any ruling that could be painted as unfair, unethical, or politically motivated. Her childhood, her education, her rise through the judicial system, everything was under siege. Some pundits sneered about her background. "Let's not ignore the elephant in the room," one talk show host smirked. "She was always going to rule this way. Look at her history. Look at her personal story. You really think she doesn't have a chip on her shoulder?" They didn't say it outright. They didn't need to. The whispers of racism were enough. Judge Lee saw the headlines, heard the sound bites, but she didn't react. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. At night, when the courthouse was empty and the city outside hummed with life, she sat in her office, staring at the towering stacks of files on her desk. Justice wasn't about emotion. It wasn't about retaliation. It was about the law. And if the law wasn't applied equally, if people like Ethan Grayson could always buy their way out of consequences, then the entire system was a lie. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was her marshal, a broad-shouldered man with wary eyes. "Ma'am, the FBI's recommending extra security. They intercepted a package addressed to you. No return address. Filled with—" He stopped, exhaling sharply. "Filled with animal remains." Judge Lee didn't flinch. She had seen threats before. This was new but not surprising. "Noted," she said evenly. "Anything else?" The marshal hesitated, then stepped inside, lowering his voice. "Ma'am, I have to ask, are you sure you don't want to step back? Take a leave of absence, even just for a little while? Let things cool down?" Judge Lee met his gaze. She understood what he was really asking. "Are you scared? Do you want out?" And maybe another person would have been. Maybe another judge would have taken the threat seriously enough to walk away, to resign, to disappear before the full weight of the backlash crushed them. But she wasn't that judge. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Tell me something," she said, her voice calm. "If it had been a poor man, a nameless man, a man with no connections, do you think there would be this kind of outrage?" The marshal sighed, shaking his head. "No, ma'am, there wouldn't." "Exactly." She leaned forward slightly. "So if the system doesn't change when it's someone without money, why should it change for someone with it?" The marshal exhaled, nodding. He understood, and so did she, because this wasn't just about Ethan Grayson anymore. This was about every corrupt CEO who had walked free, every billionaire who had settled behind closed doors while victims were left destitute, every crime that had been swept under the rug because the perpetrator had the right connections, the right amount of power, the right last name. They wanted her to be afraid. They wanted her to bend. But Judge Monica Lee had built her career on standing firm. The days passed and the threats kept coming. More letters, more phone calls, more half-truths spun into full-blown propaganda by the networks that had spent years protecting people like Ethan Grayson. Some judges might have gone silent, might have let the pressure erode their will, but she did not waver. She walked into her courtroom every day with her head held high, knowing that every case, every ruling, every decision was proof that the law was not just a weapon for the powerful, and no matter how much they tried to rewrite the story, the truth remained. Ethan Grayson had stolen billions. He had destroyed lives, and he had paid the price. They could call her biased. They could try to discredit her. They could try to scare her into silence. But Monica Lee was not afraid, and she sure as hell wasn't going anywhere. Stripped of his wealth, power, and influence, Ethan Grayson was no longer a titan of industry. He was just another inmate, and the walls of his new reality were closing in fast. The first thing Ethan Grayson noticed when the prison gates slammed shut behind him was the silence. Not the silence of luxury penthouses, where the only sounds were the quiet hum of expensive appliances and the muffled voices of people who worked for him. This was different. This was the silence of abandonment. No more clicking of polished dress shoes against marble floors. No more hum of private jet engines ready to take him anywhere at a moment's notice. No more hushed whispers of assistants scrambling to fulfill his every whim. All of it was gone. The prison guard led him through the intake process with mechanical efficiency, handing him his new reality in the form of a dull, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. The fabric was rough against his skin, nothing like the custom-tailored suits he once wore with effortless arrogance. His name, once a symbol of power and influence, was now reduced to a mere number stitched into the fabric. Ethan lifted his chin, trying to maintain the air of control that had once commanded boardrooms and manipulated markets. He was Ethan Grayson, a man whose name had carried weight in the financial world. Surely, even here, he was still someone. That illusion shattered the moment he stepped into general population. The eyes were the first thing he felt. Dozens of them, watching, sizing him up. Some filled with indifference, others with something far colder. No cameras, no reporters, no bodyguards standing between him and the people who now shared his world. He expected recognition. He expected the weight of his status to mean something. Instead, the room barely reacted. A group of inmates sat at a steel table in the far corner, playing a game of cards, not even sparing him a second glance. Others leaned against the walls, engaged in quiet conversations he wasn't a part of. A few men looked at him, not with admiration, not with fear, but with amusement, as if watching someone who had no idea what he had just walked into. And that was when it hit him. Nobody cared who he was. The guard nudged him forward. "Welcome home, Grayson," he muttered, his voice dripping with a mix of indifference and satisfaction. "Hope you like the view." The view was nothing but gray walls, rusted metal, and endless rows of faces that saw him as just another inmate. For the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson was powerless. He had imagined prison would be different. He had convinced himself that, like everything else in his life, he would find a way to bend it to his will. Perhaps a few bribes here, some favors there. Surely there were people inside who could be bought. But money meant nothing behind these walls. His first attempt at flashing his wealth came when he met his assigned bunkmate, a towering man covered in tattoos, his arms a roadmap of battles fought in places Ethan couldn't even begin to imagine. Ethan extended his hand, forcing a smirk. "Ethan Grayson," he said, as if introducing himself at an elite charity gala. "I'm sure you've heard the name." The man barely looked up from his book. Ethan cleared his throat. "Look, I get it. We're all stuck here, but that doesn't mean we can't make things comfortable. I have connections. A little money goes a long way, even in here." That finally got the man's attention. He laughed. Not a friendly laugh, not even an amused one. It was the kind of laugh that made Ethan's stomach drop. "I don't give a damn about your money," the man said, shutting his book with a thud. "You ain't special in here, Wall Street. Better learn that fast." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had spent his life walking into rooms where he was the most important person present. He had expected fear, respect, some kind of acknowledgement that he was still different from the rest of them. But here, he was nothing. Days blurred into each other, each one stripping away another piece of the world he had once controlled. The food was unrecognizable, bland, slop-like portions that bore no resemblance to the five-star meals he once took for granted. His once pristine hands, which had never known labor beyond signing multi-million-dollar deals, became calloused as he was forced into prison work shifts. But worse than the degradation was the irrelevance. Nobody cared about his pleas, his connections, his past successes. The world had moved on. The markets continued without him. The empire he had built was dismantled, his name dragged through the mud by the very people who once begged for his approval. His lawyers had stopped calling with updates. The appeals he had once been so confident in were stalled, ignored, buried under mountains of legal precedent that left no loophole for a man like him to escape through. Outside, the world still talked about Ethan Grayson, but not in the way he wanted. He wasn't the financial titan anymore. He was a cautionary tale. One night, as he lay on his thin mattress, staring at the cracked ceiling, he heard two guards talking outside his cell. "You hear about Grayson?" one of them murmured. Ethan's ears perked up. "Yeah," the other guard chuckled. "Crazy how fast people forget about a guy like that. Few months ago, he was on every news channel. Now, no one gives a damn." Ethan's chest tightened. His entire life, he had believed in control. Control over markets, over people, over fate itself. He had built an empire from nothing, shaped narratives with his wealth, pulled the strings behind the scenes. Now he didn't even exist. He had feared many things in his life: failure, irrelevance, weakness. But nothing terrified him more than being forgotten. And yet that was exactly what was happening. He turned onto his side, gripping the edge of his pillow as a cold realization settled in. This was his new reality. No escape plans. No loyal advisors whispering solutions in his ear. No contingency strategies. For the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson had no way out. He was just another prisoner, just another number, and nobody cared. Months had passed since the trial ended, but justice was not measured in verdicts alone. It was in the lives forever changed by the fight for it. The courthouse was quieter now. The media frenzy had died down, the protesters had dispersed, and the world had moved on to its next scandal. But inside Judge Monica Lee's chambers, the weight of the trial still lingered. Stacks of case files sat neatly arranged on her desk, reminders that justice never truly rested. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, filling the silence with its unyielding rhythm. Then there was a knock at the door. Her clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, stepped inside, holding a small envelope. "This came for you," she said, placing it gently on the desk. Judge Lee eyed it for a moment before picking it up. There was no return address, just her name, written in neat, slightly uneven handwriting. She ran her thumb over the crease before carefully opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if the writer had hesitated over her words. She began to read. "Dear Judge Lee, I don't know if you remember me. My name is Sophia Martinez. I'm Angela's daughter." She did remember. The image of Angela Martinez on the witness stand, voice trembling as she spoke about the life Ethan Grayson had stolen from her, was burned into Judge Lee's memory. The exhaustion, the despair, the fight to keep standing when everything had been taken. "I just wanted to say thank you." The words were simple, but they carried more weight than any gavel strike, any verdict, any ruling she had ever delivered. "Thank you for standing up for my family. Thank you for proving that people like him don't always win. My mom used to tell me that people like us don't get justice, that the world doesn't care about what happens to families like ours. But you showed us that's not true." Judge Lee exhaled slowly, her grip on the letter tightening. She had spent her career fighting battles that felt endless, issuing rulings that sometimes felt like drops of water against an unmovable stone. But this was different. You didn't just give us justice, you gave us hope. Hope. That word sat in the pit of her stomach, heavy with meaning. Justice could be cold, mechanical, a system of laws and consequences. But hope was something else entirely. It was what kept people standing when they had nothing left. It was what had carried Angela Martinez through the darkest moments of her life. It was what had brought her daughter to this moment, writing this letter. "My mom still works 2 jobs and we're still trying to rebuild, but we're okay. I'm okay. Because of you." Judge Lee closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself to feel the full weight of the words. The justice system wasn't perfect. It never had been. She had seen too many cases where power won, where the law bent to those who could afford to manipulate it. She had seen too many people walk free, too many victims left with nothing but a hollow sense of defeat. But not this time. She looked back down at the letter, her gaze lingering on the final lines. "I don't know if judges are supposed to be heroes, but you are mine." For the first time in months, Judge Lee smiled. A small, quiet smile, one that barely curved her lips but reached deep into her soul. She folded the letter carefully, pressing her fingers against the creases as if sealing something important within it. Then she placed it inside her desk drawer, where it would remain, not as evidence, not as a legal document, but as a reminder. A reminder that justice was more than laws and verdicts. It was hope. And for Judge Monica Lee, that was the real victory. Ethan Grayson's downfall was spectacular. It was the kind of justice the public craved. The image of a billionaire, once untouchable, now reduced to an inmate stripped of his power, his wealth, his very identity. His name, once synonymous with financial empire building, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. The headlines had screamed his guilt, the courtroom had cheered his sentencing, and for a brief, fleeting moment, The world believed that justice had prevailed. But had it? Beyond the walls of the prison, where Ethan now rotted, the world had not changed. The same hands that had once fed his empire continued to control the markets, shifting money, manipulating laws, keeping the gears of corruption well-oiled. The same politicians who had quietly benefited from his schemes now stood behind new financiers, new corporate giants who had learned one lesson from Ethan's fall: not to stop what they were doing, but to do it smarter. Ethan was one man, but how many more were out there? How many more untouchable figures, hidden behind legal loopholes, protected by armies of lawyers and politicians, continued to operate just beyond the reach of the law? His conviction had not changed the system. It had merely satisfied the illusion of change. In the weeks following his sentencing, the world moved on. Another scandal took over the news cycle. Another billionaire stepped into the limelight. Another corporate fraud case was swept under the rug with a quiet settlement. People still lost their homes. Retirees still found their pensions mysteriously gone. The economy still functioned in a way that rewarded those at the top, while crushing those who had nothing left to give. Angela Martinez still worked two jobs. She had won her case, but no amount of legal victory could undo the years of struggle, the nights spent in her car, the lost time she could never reclaim for her daughter. The courts had sentenced Ethan Grayson, but they had not fixed what he had broken. Peter Vaughn, the retired firefighter who had testified against Ethan, still lived in his brother's spare room, still counted every dollar, still woke up each morning knowing that his years of sacrifice had been wiped out in an instant. So what had really changed? Ethan Grayson had been a symbol, a sacrifice to the gods of public outrage, a show of force meant to convince the world that no one was above the law. But the truth was more complicated. Justice had come for Ethan only because it was convenient, only because his crimes had been too public, his arrogance too blatant, his enemies too powerful to protect him any longer. Had he played his cards differently? Had he kept a lower profile? Had he been just a little more careful? Would he still be walking free? Would he still be sitting atop his empire, laughing at the people who had dared to believe they could bring him down? These were the questions left lingering long after the courtroom had emptied, after the news cameras had packed up and moved on. Ethan Grayson had paid the price. But what about the ones who hadn't? What about the ones who never would? Behind the glass towers of Wall Street, behind the closed doors of private clubs where power was traded like currency, men like Ethan still existed. They were smarter, more careful, less reckless. They had learned from his mistakes. They knew when to pull back, when to cover their tracks, when to let someone else take the fall. Ethan had been arrogant. He had made himself the story. The ones who survived, they never let themselves become the story. They let others take the headlines, let politicians handle the damage control, let crisis teams reshape the narrative. They made sure that justice never caught up to them, because justice was never designed to catch them in the first place. It was built for the poor, the desperate, the ones without the means to fight back. It was a game, and they knew how to play it better than anyone else. Ethan Grayson had been the villain of this particular story, but his story was just one chapter in an endless book of corruption, manipulation, and power that never truly answered for its sins. So as the world moved on, as Judge Monica Lee continued her work, as Angela Martinez and Peter Vaughn picked up the pieces of their lives, as Ethan sat in his cell staring at the concrete walls that had become his world, the real question remained: had anything truly changed? Or had the system simply sacrificed one pawn to protect the kings still sitting comfortably on their thrones? Justice had been served. The trial had ended. Ethan Grayson was behind bars, stripped of his wealth, his influence, and the empire he had built on deception. The courtroom had cheered, the headlines had declared victory, and for a fleeting moment, the world believed that justice had prevailed. But justice is not a singular event. It is not a verdict, not a gavel strike, not a sentence etched into a legal document. Justice is a battle, an endless war against those who believe they are above it. Because beyond the courthouse, beyond the prison gates that now confined Ethan Grayson, the world had not changed. His conviction was a spectacle, a show of power meant to pacify the public, to create the illusion that the system worked. But the truth was far more insidious. The same mechanisms that had allowed Ethan to thrive still existed. The same loopholes, the same corrupt deals, the same hidden hands pulling the strings. They had not vanished. They had simply learned to be more careful. And as long as those systems remained, justice would always be a fight, not a guarantee. For every Ethan Grayson who fell, there were 10 more waiting in the shadows, refining their methods, ensuring that they would not make the same mistakes. They would not leave trails. They would not be so arrogant. They would not be caught. So the real question is not whether Ethan Grayson was punished. The real question is, how many more like him are still walking free? How many more billionaires continue to manipulate the system, knowing they will never set foot inside a courtroom? How many more CEOs continue to gamble with people's lives, confident that their wealth will shield them from consequences? How many more victims will be left in ruins, waiting for justice that may never come? Justice is not something that exists only within the walls of a courtroom. It is something that must be demanded. It is something that must be fought for. Judge Monica Lee knew this. She had seen the machine up close, had watched powerful men slip through its cracks, had seen how justice was not always blind, but often weighed by power and privilege. She knew that sentencing Ethan Grayson was not the end. It was merely a warning shot, a reminder that the system only works when people refuse to let it fail. Angela Martinez knew this too. She had fought for justice not just for herself, but for the thousands of others who had lost everything. She had stood in that courtroom, poured out her pain, relived the nightmare that Ethan Grayson had inflicted on her family, not because she expected a miracle, but because she knew that silence was the greatest weapon of the powerful. And silence was something she refused to give them. So where does that leave the rest of us? The fight for justice is not the responsibility of a single judge, a single courtroom, a single jury. It is our fight. It is a battle waged every day in the choices we make, in the voices we amplify, in the corruption we refuse to ignore. It is in the way we hold the powerful accountable, not just when their crimes become too big to hide, but before they ever have the chance to commit them. It is in the way we challenge systems designed to protect wealth over truth, power over fairness, influence over integrity. Because justice is not just the responsibility of the courts. It is a responsibility that belongs to all of us. And it is a fight we must never stop fighting. Justice is not just a courtroom battle. It's a fight we must take on every day. How many more Ethan Graysons are still out there, untouched by the law? How many victims will never see justice because the system is built to protect the powerful? We can't stay silent. We can't look away. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in holding the powerful accountable, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video. Let's keep exposing the truth. Let's make sure justice is not just for the privileged, but for everyone. Black little boy points at a cop in court. The shocking truth he reveals leaves everyone shocked. The courtroom was electric with tension. Reporters scribbled, cameras flashed, and a sea of uniformed officers loomed behind the defense. Outside, protesters roared, "Justice for David Johnson." Their voices rattled the courthouse walls, demanding an end to corruption. At the defense table, Michael Reeves sat smug, a man who had always walked free behind his badge. His high-powered lawyers exuded confidence, ready to twist the truth. Across the aisle, Maya Johnson sat rigid, fists clenched, eyes burning. Her husband's blood haunted her dreams. Today, justice would be served, or the system would betray her again. Then the moment came. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a bailiff called for the next witness. A hush fell over the room as Elijah Johnson, barely 10 years old, stepped forward. He was small, almost lost in the oversized witness chair, but his presence was magnetic. He met the judge's gaze with unnerving steadiness, then turned toward the defense. Reeves's smirk faltered slightly. Perhaps for the first time, he saw the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just a child taking the stand. This was the witness they had overlooked. This was the boy who had seen everything. The prosecutor stepped forward, her voice calm but charged with significance. "Elijah, can you identify the man who killed your father?" The world seemed to stop. Elijah inhaled deeply, the kind of breath one takes before plunging into deep, uncharted waters. His gaze moved past the judge, past the jury, and locked onto Reeves. The tension in the room became unbearable. The boy's hand rose, his finger extending toward the man who had shattered his world. His voice, clear and unwavering, sliced through the silence. "He killed my daddy." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Maya exhaled sharply, her lips pressed together to keep herself from breaking. Reeves, for the first time, paled. The room hung in the stunned silence, the weight of a child's truth bearing down on every soul present. A storm of emotions played across Reeves' face, shock, disbelief, then a flicker of something more dangerous. His jaw tightened, his fingers curled into fists. The walls were closing in. The defense attorney bolted to his feet, his voice a sharp crack against the silence. "Objection! This is emotional manipulation. A child's accusation cannot be taken as evidence." The prosecutor didn't flinch. "We will prove otherwise." The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but nothing could erase the seismic shift in the courtroom. The balance of power had tilted. The boy had spoken, and now the world was about to hear the truth. The tension in the room thickened as Elijah exhaled, his small hands gripping the edge of the witness stand. His mind, sharp as ever, reached back not just to the night his father was murdered, but to the beginning of it all. And so, the story unraveled. The West Side neighborhood was changing, but not in the way its longtime residents had hoped. Once a thriving community where families had built lives across generations, it was now being swallowed whole by development firms, their glossy brochures promising revitalization, while bulldozers flattened history. Small businesses were closing one by one, their owners forced to sell for insultingly low prices or lose everything to new zoning laws and skyrocketing property taxes. The ones who resisted faced something far worse: visits from city officials, endless inspections, fines that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. It wasn't renewal, it was removal. David Johnson had watched it happen to his neighbors, one after another. The barber who had cut his hair since childhood suddenly found his shop shut down due to unsanitary conditions. The corner grocery that had provided fresh produce to the block for decades was hit with a surprise tax audit and forced into foreclosure. He knew the pattern, and now it was his turn. The Johnson family pharmacy had stood at the same corner for over 40 years, a legacy passed down from David's father. It wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary, a place where neighbors knew they'd be treated with care, where prescriptions could be paid off in small installments if money was tight. David refused to sell no matter how many offers landed on his desk, no matter how many warnings came his way. His wife Maya knew the risks. As a lawyer, she had spent years fighting for families being driven from their homes by corporate greed disguised as progress. She had seen firsthand how the system was rigged, how laws could be twisted to serve those who wrote them. But even she underestimated how far they would go. The first fine was for a mislabeled inventory shelf. Then came the surprise health inspection, where a fridge was declared 1 degree too warm. Next, the fire department showed up, claiming the store's emergency exit signs were not up to code, though they had passed inspection just months prior. It was calculated, systematic. They weren't just coming for the pharmacy, they were coming for David. Then the phone call started. No threats, just silence. Sometimes a single breath before the line went dead. Sometimes the same unknown number calling at 3 a.m. One night, David sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the floor. "They want me gone," he said simply. Maya reached for his hand, but he didn't move. "And if I don't leave, they'll find a way to take everything." Elijah, their 10-year-old son, listened from the hallway, unseen. He wasn't like other kids. His mind worked differently. He remembered things, every detail, every sound, every pattern. His parents called it a gift. Sometimes it felt like a curse. He had seen the stress in his father's eyes, the way his mother checked the locks twice before going to bed. He knew something was coming. Then late one night, it did. David got out of bed quietly, thinking Maya was asleep. She wasn't. "Where are you going?" she whispered, sitting up. "Just need some air," he said, but he was already putting on his jacket. "David, don't do this." Her voice was sharp, edged with fear. "I have to," he said, voice tight. "I need to know what I'm dealing with." Maya knew arguing wouldn't stop him, So she watched as he walked out the door, the tension in her chest tightening like a vice. Elijah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He could feel it, a heaviness in the air, a warning in his bones. He wasn't supposed to leave the house at night, but tonight he had to. Slipping out of bed, he moved silently, the way his father had taught him in their late-night spy games. He grabbed his jacket, stuffed his small recorder watch into his pocket, and slipped out the back door, following the sound of his father's footsteps down the street. David walked with purpose, head down, shoulders tense. He didn't know he was being followed, not by his son, and not by the shadows watching him from the alleys. Elijah stayed a safe distance back, his small frame blending into the night. He didn't know where his father was going, but he knew it wasn't good. Then he saw it. David crossed into an empty parking lot behind an abandoned supermarket. The lot was dimly lit, the flickering streetlights casting long, jagged shadows. 3 men were waiting for him. Elijah ducked behind a dumpster, heart pounding. Michael Reeves stood with his hands in his pockets. The casual arrogance of a man who knew he couldn't be touched. He had spent years as a decorated officer, but those who knew better understood what he really was, a man who enforced the law only when it served him. Beside him stood Thomas Harrison, a real estate mogul whose name had been plastered across half the city's new development projects. He was clean-cut, polished, but Elijah could see it, the cold calculation in his eyes. Third man was Frank Porter, a city councilman with a smile as slimy as his reputation. He was the one who made sure all the right paperwork got filed, that policies were rewritten to benefit those who paid him. David stopped a few feet away. "You've been making things difficult," Harrison said, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. David crossed his arms. "I'm not selling." Reeves sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher. David, David, you're being stubborn. We've tried the polite way. Now we have to try something else." David clenched his jaw. "You can harass me all you want. I'm not going anywhere." Porter chuckled, stepping forward. "Oh, but you will. You see, we don't need you to sell. We just need you to be unavailable." Elijah held his breath. "I've already been through your so-called inspections," David said. "You have nothing," Harrison smiled. "Yet." Reeves stepped forward, his voice lowering. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to find something suspicious in your next inventory check. A few bottles you don't remember ordering. Some prescriptions that don't add up. It'll be a real shame when the DEA gets tipped off about an illegal operation happening right under your nose." David's fist clenched, but Reeves wasn't done. "And if that doesn't work, maybe you get caught up in a misunderstanding with the wrong officer. Maybe something escalates. Maybe one night you just don't make it home." A chill ran down Elijah's spine. David's voice was steel. "I won't let you do this." Reeves smiled, a predator sizing up prey. "Oh, you won't have a choice." That's when it happened. Elijah shifted his weight slightly, his foot pressing against an empty bottle. It rolled. The sound was deafening. Reeves's head snapped toward the noise. "What was that?" Elijah didn't wait. Elijah ran, his heartbeat thundering in his ears, his small legs pushing as fast as they could. Behind him, the sound of Reeves cursing, the scuff of hurried footsteps, then silence. He didn't dare look back. He weaved through alleys, slipping through gaps only a child could fit through, his breath ragged, his chest burning. He had to get home, had to get back before they realized who he was. By the time he reached the house, his limbs felt like lead. He paused at the back door, forcing himself to breathe, to calm the tremor in his hands before slipping inside, moving silently through the darkened hallway. He had just made it to his room, his mind racing with what he had just witnessed, when he heard the front door unlock. David was home. David stepped through the front door, locking it behind him with a slow, deliberate motion. His hands trembled just slightly, so subtly that only someone who knew him well would notice. He exhaled, his breath shallow, his body tense beneath the weight of what he had just witnessed. The meeting, the threats, the certainty that his time was running out. His mind replayed every word, every movement, every glance exchanged between Reeves, Harrison, and Porter. They weren't bluffing. They had already decided his fate. The only question now was how soon they would act. The house was quiet, The kind of silence that felt too heavy, too unnatural. He knew Maya was awake, waiting. She always knew when something was wrong. As he stepped into the dimly lit living room, he saw her sitting on the couch, arms crossed, her gaze locked onto him the moment he entered. She wasn't reading, wasn't watching TV, just waiting. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "You went out," she said, her voice steady but sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. David nodded, slipping off his jacket, careful not to let her see the way his fingers clenched the fabric. "Needed some air." Maya's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me." He sighed, running a hand down his face. He was exhausted, but there was no point in pretending with her. Not now. He sat down across from her, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. "It's happening," he said finally. She didn't ask what he meant. She already knew. "How bad?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but no less intense. David hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud made it real. He met her gaze, his own filled with something unreadable: fear, anger, defiance, all tangled together. "They're done playing games," he said. "They want me gone. And if I don't go willingly, they'll make sure I don't have a choice." Maya inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around her arms. "Then we go to the press. We go to the DA. They own the system," David cut in, his voice low but firm. "You know that. The police, the city council, the courts, they've got them all. If I push back too hard, they'll come after more than just the pharmacy." Maya's breath hitched. Her grip on her arms loosened, as if she had just realized something even worse than what he had said. "They'll come after us." David didn't answer, but the silence said enough. For the first time in their marriage, she saw something in him she had never seen before: helplessness. Not because he was afraid, but because he had run out of moves. The man who had always found a way, who had always protected his family, who had always been in control, was now staring down an enemy too powerful to fight. A long silence stretched between them. Then Maya straightened her back. "We leave," she said, her voice suddenly resolute. "We take Elijah and go. Tonight." David shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "They'd find us. And running means they win." Maya's throat tightened. She had spent years battling corruption in the courtroom, believing in justice even when it seemed impossible. But this wasn't about the law. This was about survival. "So what do we do?" she demanded, her voice cracking. David looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then finally he reached across the table, took her hand, and squeezed it gently. His grip was steady now, firm. "I'll handle it," he said. Maya stared at him, searching his face, looking for some hint of a plan. "How?" He exhaled, forcing himself to smile, as if it were just another problem to solve, just another fire to put out. "Trust me." She wanted to fight him on it, to demand answers, to refuse to let him carry this alone. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the truth. He had already decided. He had already accepted the risk. She swallowed hard. "I don't want to lose you." David brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. "You won't," he promised. But in his heart, he knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. As dawn approached, the weight of the previous night lingered in David's chest like a storm waiting to break. He had barely slept, his mind replaying every word, every threat from the meeting in the parking lot. He knew they would come for him, he just didn't know when. But when the morning sun rose and the pharmacy opened as usual, a small part of him dared to hope. Maybe today wouldn't be the day. Maybe he still had time. But hope was a fragile thing, and it shattered the moment the front door burst open. The bell above the pharmacy door chimed a familiar sound, one David Johnson had heard 1,000 times before. But this time, it was different. The air shifted, thick with something unseen but undeniable. Instinctively, he looked up from the prescription he was filling, and in that instant, he knew. They had come for him. The door burst open before the bell had even stopped ringing. Uniformed officers flooded into the pharmacy, boots thudding against the tile floor. Their movements were sharp, rehearsed. This wasn't an inspection. This was an ambush. Customers gasped, backing away as officers spread out like a pack of wolves, cornering their prey. David's heart slammed against his ribs, but he forced himself to stay calm. He stepped forward, raising his hand slightly, a gesture of controlled defiance. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. Michael Reeves stepped through the doorway last, moving with the slow, deliberate arrogance of a man who already knew how this would end. He wore his badge-like armor, his uniform pristine, his eyes gleaming with something dark, something triumphant. He pulled a folded document from his pocket and held it up for show. "Search warrant," Reeves announced, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We have reason to believe this establishment is involved in the illegal distribution of controlled substances." The words sent a chill down David's spine. He knew what was happening. He had known it was coming, but knowing didn't make it any less horrifying. "You're lying," David said, his voice low, controlled. "You know damn well this is a legitimate business." Reeves smirked. "Then you won't mind us taking a look." He nodded, and in an instant, the officers moved. Drawers yanked open, shelves pulled apart, inventory scattered across the counter. Customers were hurried out the door, a few staying just long enough to watch in the stunned silence. David clenched his fists, every instinct screaming at him to stop them. But what could he do? They had the power here. They had already written the ending to this story. He turned to Reeves, forcing himself to meet the man's gaze. "You don't even care how obvious this is, do you?" David asked. Reeves chuckled, shaking his head. "Obvious doesn't matter. Only proof does." A crash echoed from the back room, one of the officers knocking over a stack of medicine bottles. David flinched. His whole life, everything his father had built, was being ripped apart right in front of him. Then it happened. "Got something?" The voice came from one of the officers near the storage shelves. All movement in the room stopped. The officer held up a small, unlabeled pill bottle. A silence, thick and suffocating, filled the space. David's stomach dropped. The officer twisted the cap off, shaking out a few white pills. He held them up for all to see. "What is this, Johnson?" Reeves asked, mock curiosity laced in his voice. "Unregistered medication? No records? That's a felony." "That's not mine," David said instantly, stepping forward. "Someone put that there." Reeves sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher. "Come on, David. You're a smart man. Smart enough to know this isn't looking good for you." Another shout came from the other side of the room. "There's more!" David turned, watching in horror, as another officer pulled out an envelope thick, filled with cash from a drawer near the register. The pharmacy had never seen that kind of money. David had never handled cash in that way. Every transaction, every sale was accounted for. But here it was, planted. Reeves let out a slow whistle. "Now that's interesting." David's pulse roared in his ears. He turned, looking around the room, searching for someone, anyone who could see what was happening. But the officers weren't interested in the truth. They never had been. Reeves took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for only David to hear. "You should have taken the deal." David's body went rigid. This wasn't a mistake. It was never about an investigation. It was punishment. An officer grabbed David's arm, yanking it behind his back. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into his skin. "You can't do this," he snapped, trying to jerk free. But another officer shoved him forward. "Oh, I can," Reeves said smoothly. He turned to the others. "David Johnson, you are under arrest for possession and distribution of illegal pharmaceuticals." The words cut through him like a blade. David struggled, not in desperation, but in rage. "You set me up," he growled, his voice raw with fury. Reeves leaned in, just close enough that only David could hear. "Of course I did." David's chest heaved. The walls of his pharmacy, the place he had spent his entire life protecting, blurred around him. Elijah crouched low beneath the pharmacy window, his small frame pressed tightly against the cold brick wall. His breath came in shallow gasps, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the strap of his watch. His father had given it to him on his last birthday, a sleek, black timepiece that was more than just a watch. It was a recorder, and tonight it might be the only thing that could prove the truth. Through the narrow gap in the window, he saw everything. The pharmacy, once a place of warmth and healing, was now a war zone. The shelves were overturned, bottles shattered across the floor like fallen soldiers in a silent battle. The air was thick with tension, and in the middle of it all stood David Johnson, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face a mask of defiance. Michael Reeves stood opposite him, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His expression was calm, too calm. Elijah had seen that look before, the way a predator watched its prey right before the kill. Around them, officers moved methodically, not in chaos, but with purpose. This wasn't an investigation. It was an execution. David's voice was steady, but Elijah could hear the tightly contained fury beneath it. "You have no right to be here," he said. "This is a setup, and you know it." Reeves smirked, taking a slow step forward. "You've been a thorn in our side for too long, David. We gave you every opportunity to walk away. You should have taken it." David straightened his spine, lifting his chin. "I'm calling my lawyer." He reached toward the counter where his phone lay, his movements slow and deliberate. He knew better than to make any sudden moves around a cop like Reeves, but it didn't matter. Reeves's expression didn't change, but his voice did. It rose, sharp, commanding, filled with artificial urgency. "Gun!" he shouted. For a fraction of a second, everything stood still. Then the world exploded. Two shots rang out, deafening, slicing through the air like a blade. Elijah flinched, pressing his hands over his mouth to stifle the scream rising in his throat. His father staggered backward. David's face was frozen in shock, his mouth slightly open, as if he was about to speak. But no words came, only the sound of his body hitting the floor, hard, his head striking the tile with a sickening thud. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. Then the blood came. It spread slowly at first, then faster, seeping into the cracks of the floor, staining the pristine white of his pharmacist's coat a deep, horrifying red. Elijah's breath caught in his chest, his body locked in place. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but he couldn't. He could only watch. Reeves exhaled, shaking his head as if mildly inconvenienced. He holstered his gun, then crouched beside David's body. Elijah's stomach twisted as he watched Reeves reach into his own ankle holster and pull out a second gun, a smaller one, black, unmarked. With the ease of a man who had done this before, Reeves placed the gun next to David's outstretched hand. Elijah felt like he was going to be sick. Reeves pressed a hand to his radio. His voice was calm, detached, like he was reporting a routine traffic stop. 1970, suspect reached for a weapon. Officer had to use deadly force. Scene secure. Lies. Every word a carefully constructed lie. Elijah's fingers dug into the dirt beneath the window ledge, his nails scraping against the concrete. His heart pounded so violently he thought it might give him away. He forced himself to breathe, to stay still. If they saw him, if they knew he was there, he would be next. Inside the pharmacy, the officers moved quickly. One of them kicked over a few more bottles, creating a scene of disorder. Another nudged the fake gun closer to David's fingers with the toe of his boot. They were making it look real. Elijah's grip on his watch tightened. The red recording light blinked steadily. He had captured everything the moment Reeves shouted, the way his father had been unarmed, the planted evidence. The truth was there, locked inside this tiny device strapped to his wrist. He just had to survive long enough to use it. His body felt like it was made of lead, every muscle locked in place as he watched them work. The world around him blurred, but every sound was sharp, every movement burned into his memory. David wasn't moving. That thought hit Elijah harder than the gunshots. His father, the man who had taught him how to ride a bike, who made pancakes on Saturday mornings, who kissed him on the forehead every night before bed, wasn't moving. Tears burned at the back of Elijah's eyes, but he couldn't let them fall. Not here, not now. A car engine rumbled outside. The wail of sirens grew louder. More officers were arriving. Soon the scene would be locked down, the crime tape put up, the narrative set in stone. Elijah had to go. He swallowed hard, forcing his shaking limbs to move. Slowly, inch by inch, he backed away from the window. His heartbeat roared in his ears, drowning out every other sound. He reached the alley, his feet light against the pavement. One wrong step, one noise, and it would be over. He took one last look through the window. Reeves was talking to another officer, his back turned. Maya was nowhere in sight. Had someone called her yet? Had she heard? Elijah's fingers clenched into fists. The flashing red and blue lights painted the night in eerie streaks, reflecting off the shattered glass of the pharmacy window. The scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Officers moved like clockwork, their actions precise, rehearsed, controlling the scene, controlling the narrative. Elijah ran. He didn't know how his legs carried him, didn't know how his breath kept up with the burning in his chest. But he ran. He had to. By the time he reached home, his lungs felt like they were on fire, his body trembling from more than just exhaustion. He pushed through the front door, his mind a blur of panic and rage. Maya turned at the sound, her eyes widening the moment she saw his face. "Elijah," she breathed, stepping forward. "What?" "It was a setup," he gasped. "They killed him, and now they're going to lie about it." Even as the words left his mouth, the television flickered to life behind her, and the lie had already begun. Fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The morning after the shooting, the city awoke to headlines that rewrote the truth. Neighborhood pharmacist shot dead in drug raid. Authorities confirm suspect had a weapon. Police chief defends officers. It was a justified action. The news spread like wildfire, each outlet running the same narrative, carefully constructed, perfectly aligned. There were no questions, no doubts. Just a single, controlled version of events, the version that protected the system, that painted David Johnson not as a victim, but as a criminal who had been caught in the act. Elijah sat on the living room floor, staring at the television screen. His hands gripped the edge of his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Maya stood behind him, her arms crossed, her entire body rigid as the newscaster delivered the story with detached professionalism. A routine narcotics investigation turned deadly last night when local pharmacist David Johnson was fatally shot by law enforcement. Officials state that Johnson was under investigation for illegal distribution of controlled substances, and when officers attempted to execute a search warrant, the suspect reached for a firearm. Officer Michael Reeves, fearing for his safety, was forced to open fire. No officers were injured in the exchange. A video played carefully edited body cam footage, cutting in right as David was reaching for his phone. The screen froze just before the gunshots, before his body hit the ground. A voiceover filled the silence. Police confirmed that Johnson was in possession of an unregistered firearm, believed to have been used in the illegal drug trade. Authorities also discovered large sums of cash on the premises. Maya inhaled sharply. Elijah could feel the rage radiating from her, the way her breathing grew heavier, her fingers twitching at her sides as if she was restraining herself from throwing something at the screen. "They're lying," Elijah whispered, barely recognizing his own voice. Maya didn't respond. She didn't need to. The news continued, shifting seamlessly from crime scene footage to a press conference where Police Chief Williams stood at a podium, his uniform crisp, his expression solemn. Behind him, Reeves stood among a line of officers, his posture perfect, his face blank, no remorse, no guilt, just control. "This was a tragic but necessary action," Chief Williams declared. "Our officers put their lives on the line every day to keep this city safe. Last night, they encountered a suspect who refused to cooperate, who made the choice to escalate the situation. This is never the outcome we want, but Officer Reeves followed protocol. The body cam footage speaks for itself." Elijah's stomach twisted as reporters fired off questions, all of them useless. "Chief, was there prior evidence linking Johnson to drug trafficking?" "We are actively investigating all angles, but we wouldn't have been there if we didn't have reason to be." "Can you confirm if Johnson fired a weapon?" "We can confirm a weapon was found at the scene." No mention of how it got there. No mention of the recording Elijah still had strapped to his wrist. Maya grabbed the remote and shut the TV off. The room plunged into silence, but Elijah's mind was still screaming. He had seen the truth. He had recorded it. But the world wasn't interested in the truth. It had already chosen a side. Outside, the city moved on, its people consuming the headlines without question. Social media flooded with posts about the dangerous pharmacist who had been taken down. Some questioned the story, but they were drowned out by those who accepted the official version without hesitation. play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Another criminal off the streets. Good job, officers. Funny how people are suddenly saints after they get caught breaking the law. Elijah's fist clenched so hard his nails dug into his palms. Mom, he said finally, his voice unsteady but determined, we have to do something. Maya didn't answer right away. She turned, walking toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to glance outside. Two black SUVs were parked across the street, their tinted windows concealing the figures inside. Watching, waiting. They control the police, she murmured. The courts, the press. Her voice was barely above a whisper. If we go to them with the truth, they'll bury it, and us along with it. Elijah swallowed hard. So what do we do? Maya turned to face him, her eyes filled with something he had never seen in them before. Not just anger, not just grief, but something deeper. A wariness, a realization that they were fighting an enemy far bigger than they had ever imagined. We don't give them the truth, she said. Not yet. Elijah frowned. But if we don't, she cut him off. Right now, they control the story. If we fight back too soon, they'll twist everything we say. She took a slow, steady breath. We need proof, not just a recording. We need something they can't ignore, something they can't spin. Elijah's mind raced. He thought about the night before, about everything his father had told him. Remember everything. His fingers brushed against the strap of his watch, the device still holding the last moments of his father's life. The truth, locked inside a tiny piece of metal and wire. But would it be enough? Maya crouched down in front of him, gripping his shoulders. You're the only one who saw what really happened, she said. They don't know that, which means, for now, you're safe. Elijah stared at her. For now? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew the truth. David was dead, but the people who had killed him weren't finished yet. The city moved on, but Maya and Elijah could feel the shift beneath their feet. It started with the silence calls that went unanswered, conversations that ended when they walked into a room. Then came the whispers, the sideways glances, the polite but deliberate distance. People didn't want to pick a side, but silence was a choice. And soon Maya and Elijah realized they weren't just mourning David. They were being erased alongside him. The silence was worse than the whispers. At first it was subtle, the way the neighbors averted their eyes when Maya walked down the street, the way conversations died the moment she entered a room. People who once greeted her with warmth, who had shared coffee over morning walks, now suddenly found reasons to cross the street when they saw her coming. The same people who had trusted David with their prescriptions, who had praised his generosity, now acted as if his name was something dirty, something dangerous. The divide in the community was clear. Some believed the official story. They repeated the headlines, regurgitated the police statements, convinced themselves that David had to be guilty, that the man they had known for years, the man who had delivered medicine to their sick parents, had been secretly running a criminal operation behind their backs. Others weren't so sure. They saw the inconsistencies, the way the media coverage felt too neat, too rehearsed. But suspicion was dangerous, and doubt didn't pay the bills, so they stayed silent. Elijah felt it worst at school, the stares, the hushed conversations that stopped just as he walked by. He could hear his name in the murmurs, the accusations hiding beneath forced smiles. My dad says his father was a drug dealer. The police wouldn't have shot him if he was innocent. I heard they found thousands of dollars in cash at his store. At lunch, his usual table was empty. Kids who had once played basketball with him now avoided him like a disease. Even his teachers treated him differently, more distant, more careful, as if he was a ticking bomb, a scandal waiting to happen. He tried to pretend it didn't matter. But when he reached into his locker one afternoon and found the words "like father," "like son" scrawled in black marker across the inside, something in him cracked. Maya wasn't faring any better. The law firm where she worked hadn't fired her, not officially, but cases were quietly reassigned. Meetings were suddenly rescheduled or canceled altogether. Her emails went unanswered. The partners weren't subtle about it. They didn't need to be. The message was clear. She was a liability. No one wanted to be associated with the widow of a suspected drug dealer. She fought back the way she always had, with facts, with the law. She filed motions, demanded access to unedited footage. sent formal complaints about the police department's handling of the case. Every request was met with delays, denials, roadblocks. The system was working exactly as it was designed to. Then came the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, slid under their front door rather than mailed. The paper was thick, the wording precise, cold. Notice of mortgage rate adjustment. The bank won. They had never missed a payment to had suddenly reassessed their loan. The new interest rate was more than double what it had been before, a figure designed not just to inconvenience them, but to crush them. Maya read the letter twice, then again, willing the words to change. They hadn't just killed David, they were coming for everything he had built. She stormed into the bank the next morning, Elijah in tow. The branch manager, a man in an expensive suit with a rehearsed smile, welcomed her into his office with the kind of politeness that barely concealed condescension. "I'm afraid this is just an unfortunate result of market fluctuations," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "Interest rates have been rising." "Not like this," Maya snapped. She slid the letter across the desk. "This isn't a fluctuation. This is targeted." The manager sighed as if she was being unreasonable. "Ms. Johnson, I understand this is a difficult time for your family, but these adjustments are standard practice." "No, they're not," she cut in. "I've seen the records. I checked with my neighbors. No one else has had their rate adjusted, just me." She leaned forward. "Tell me, does the bank have any special interests in properties in my neighborhood? Any investors interested in clearing out homes?" The manager stiffened. It was quick, barely noticeable, but Maya caught it. She had spent years in courtrooms. She knew a guilty man when she saw one. "I'll look into it," he said smoothly, but she could already hear the dismissal in his voice. Elijah sat quietly beside her, his hands clenched in his lap. He wasn't just listening, he was memorizing. The tone of the man's voice, papers on his desk, the way his fingers twitched when he lied. They left without answers, but Maya knew the truth now. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about erasure. They weren't just punishing her for fighting back. They were making sure she had no way to fight at all. Maya sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't taken a sip from in hours. The house was too quiet, too still. The kind of silence that didn't bring peace, only dread. The eviction notice sat on the counter, the ink bleeding into the paper where her fingers had gripped it too tightly. They were out of time. "We leave tomorrow," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Across the table, Elijah sat unmoving. "No," he said. Maya looked up. "Elijah, we don't have a choice." His hands clenched into fists. "Yes, we do." "Elijah?" "I remember everything," he said, his voice firm, his eyes unblinking. "I have proof." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maya's stomach twisted. She had spent weeks trying to shield him, to protect what was left of their lives. But Elijah had never needed protection, not like this, not from the truth. Slowly, he pulled back his sleeve, revealing the watch on his wrist. Maya's breath caught. "Dad told me to remember," Elijah said. "So I did." He unfastened the strap, placed the watch on the table, and pressed play. The room filled with the past. David's voice steady but firm. Reeves' voice calm, calculated. Then the lie. "Gun!" The shots. The body hitting the ground. The sound of metal scraping against tile as Reeves planted the weapon. Suspect resisted. Had to fire. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her fist against her mouth to keep from sobbing. It was all there. Every moment. Every word. And then a second recording. The voices shifted. It was the night before. The bodega parking lot. Harrison's voice, smooth as oil. "The pharmacy is the last piece. We need it cleared by the end of the quarter." Reeves, irritated. "I've tried everything, fines, inspections, threats. He won't budge." Porter, laughing. "Then make him a criminal." Maya's hands trembled as she hit stop. The room felt smaller. The air, heavier. "Elijah," she whispered, "why didn't you tell me?" His jaw tightened. "Would you have believed me?" She exhaled shakily, pressing her fingers to her temples. This changed everything, or at least it should have. The next morning, Maya didn't pack. She didn't load their car. Instead, she walked into the district attorney's office, gripping Elijah's watch so tightly in her palm that the edges bit into her skin. Sarah Andrews sat behind a polished oak desk, her expression unreadable. She was younger than Maya expected, with sharp features and the kind of eyes that had seen too much. Maya placed the watch on the desk and pressed play. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. When the recordings ended, the silence stretched between them. Andrews exhaled through her nose, leaned back in her chair, and laced her fingers together. Then she said the words Maya hadn't expected. "It's not enough." Maya blinked. "What?" Andrews sighed, rubbing her temple. "This is good, but good isn't enough. It's Reeves. It's Harrison. It's a direct order to frame David." "It's a conversation," Andrews interrupted. "A conversation between three men who never explicitly state a crime. There's no direct admission, no planted evidence. No, we're going to kill him tomorrow." She shook her head. "Do you know how easy it would be for a defense attorney to spin this? They'll say Reeves was venting. They'll say make him a criminal was a joke. They'll say your son misinterpreted everything." Maya's breath hitched. "They'll destroy him," Andrews said quietly. She met Maya's eyes, and for the first time, her expression softened. "You want my honest opinion? If you come forward with this now, they'll bury it. They'll attack Elijah's credibility, twist your motives, and by the time they're done, your husband's name will be even more tarnished than it already is." Maya felt her chest tighten. "So what?" she snapped. "We just stay quiet? Let them win?" Andrews studied her for a long moment. Then finally she said, "You don't have enough yet." Maya's stomach dropped. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the hum of the office. "What?" Andrews sighed, rubbing her temple. "This proves Reeves was involved, but it doesn't prove a conspiracy. It doesn't link the mayor, the developers, the police chief, and it doesn't prove beyond reasonable doubt that your husband wasn't armed." Maya's voice sharpened. "He wasn't armed." Andrews didn't flinch. "I believe you, but belief isn't evidence." The words hit like a slap. Maya forced herself to breathe, to think. "You want more?" she said, voice low and dangerous. "Fine, I'll give you more." Andrews met her gaze, unreadable. "Be careful, Mrs. Johnson." Maya stood. "No," she said. "They should be careful." The post went live at midnight. Maya sat in the dim glow of the laptop screen, her hands trembling over the keyboard. The title was simple. "They killed my husband. This is the proof." The video attached 13 minutes and 26 seconds of raw, unfiltered truth contained no edits, no commentary, no explanations, just the sound of Reeves orchestrating an execution. Maya hit upload. Then she waited, and the world caught fire. By morning, it had been viewed over 2 million times. By noon, Justice for David trended across every platform. By evening, the protests began. The city streets pulsed with fury. Crowds flooded the sidewalks, marching in unison, their voices echoing between the high-rise buildings. The signs they carried were blunt, raw. "Reeves is a murderer. Justice for David. No more cover-ups." At the heart of it, standing on the steps of City Hall, Maya faced a sea of reporters. She didn't need a microphone. The anger, the heartbreak in her voice carried through the air. "My husband was murdered," she said, "and they called it justice." A roar from the crowd. "They told me there wasn't enough evidence." Her hands curled into fists. "So I gave them more." Cameras flashed. News anchors whispered into microphones. Officials inside the building scrambled. "They will tell you this doesn't matter," she continued, "that it's complicated, that we should let them handle it." She let the words settle. Then, "I say no more." The crowd erupted. Behind the glass windows of City Hall, the mayor's staff watched with nervous eyes. They had ignored this for too long. Now it was out of their control. And then, as if the universe itself had chosen this moment to drive the truth home, a chant rose from the crowd. "Open the case! Open the case! Open the case!" The pressure was undeniable, and finally, under the weight of an entire city's rage, the system cracked. By midnight, the official announcement came. A trial would be held. Maya didn't smile. This wasn't victory. This was war. The trial was never meant to reach this point. The system had done everything to suppress it, silencing witnesses, burying evidence, twisting the narrative. They had underestimated the fire that grief could ignite. They had underestimated Maya, but most of all, they had underestimated Elijah. He had watched from the shadows as the world debated his father's worth. He had listened to the lies, seen the people who once called David a friend hesitate before saying his name. He had carried the weight of the truth alone, knowing that one day he would have to speak it. That day had come. As he stepped onto the witness stand, the air in the courtroom tightened, every pair of eyes locked onto him. The boy who had seen everything was finally about to tell the world. The courthouse was suffocating under the weight of power. Rows of officers filled the right side of the gallery, their uniforms pristine, their expressions impassive, their presence a silent warning. Their badges gleamed under the artificial lights, a stark contrast to the dark undercurrent of intimidation they carried. The defense team sat smugly at their table, their suits crisp, their confidence unwavering. Reeves, in the center of it all, exuded the quiet arrogance of a man who had always walked free. On the left, the community sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of rage, grief, and hope. Some clutched photographs of David Johnson. Others wore shirts emblazoned with his name. Outside, the echoes of thousands chanting for justice seeped through the thick walls, a reminder that this trial was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a reckoning. Maya sat rigid, her nails digging into her palms. She had fought tooth and nail to get here, to drag the truth into the light. But now at the final moment, she could do nothing but watch as her 10-year-old son stepped onto the stand. The courtroom fell silent. Elijah climbed into the witness seat, his small frame dwarfed by the wooden chair. His feet barely touched the ground, but his posture was unshaken. The judge watched him carefully, as if debating whether a child had any place in this war. Sarah Andrews approached, her voice steady. "Elijah, do you remember what happened the day your father died?" Elijah didn't blink. "Yes." His voice was clear, strong. The room shifted. The jury leaned forward. The defense attorney, Eleanor Bradford, uncrossed her legs, suddenly interested. Andrews nodded. "Tell us, in your own words, what you saw." Elijah took a deep breath. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the judge. He looked directly at Reeves. "I was outside the pharmacy," he said, "hiding, watching." Reeves tensed. "I saw my dad standing with his hands up," Elijah continued, his voice unwavering. "I saw Officer Reeves tell him to step back. My dad asked to call his lawyer." The courtroom held its breath. Then Reeves yelled, "Gun!" Elijah's voice didn't rise, but the words cut through the air like a blade. "And he shot my dad." Gasps rippled through the crowd. On the left, someone stifled a sob. Maya squeezed her hands into fists, her whole body trembling. Andrews let the silence settle before speaking again. "Elijah," she said carefully, "is the person who shot your father in this courtroom today?" For the first time, Elijah moved. His small hand rose, slow but unwavering, and he pointed, directly at Reeves. "He killed my dad." The room exploded. Shouts erupted from the gallery. The judge's gavel slammed down, demanding order. Some of the officers stiffened, their hands twitching toward their belts. Reeves's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He didn't speak. The moment stretched, unbreakable. And then so soft it was almost lost beneath the noise. Reeves whispered, "You should have stayed quiet, boy." Elijah heard him, but he wasn't afraid. He wasn't silent anymore. The prosecution table was still, the defense rigid, the jury frozen in anticipation. Every eye was locked on the small recording device in Sarah Andrews' hand. The moment she pressed play, everything would change. With slow, deliberate movements, she lifted the recorder toward the microphone. A single click echoed through the chamber. And then, "If he won't sell, we'll make him a criminal." Reeves's voice, cold, calculated. A sentence spoken in the shadows, never meant to see the light of day. The weight of the words suffocated the room. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scrambled to take notes, some already dashing toward the exit to call their editors. A man in the jury box shifted uncomfortably. Even the judge, who had maintained an air of neutrality, tightened his grip on the gavel. Elijah didn't move. He had heard those words before. He had lived them. Maya closed her eyes just for a second, as if absorbing the weight of what she had fought so hard to bring into the open. The truth was no longer just theirs. It was out, irrefutable. And then lies! Reeves shot to his feet, his face twisted in fury. That recording is manipulated. This kid is lying. This whole damn thing is a setup. His voice, once so smug, now cracked under the pressure. It was a sound no one in that courtroom had ever heard before of fear. Andrews remained calm. Officer Reeves, I remind you that outbursts will not be tolerated. Reeves slammed a fist against the defense table. This is ridiculous. You're taking the word of a damn child over a decorated officer? Over me? No one responded, because they all knew the answer. The defense team sat in stunned silence. Eleanor Bradford, the attorney who had once worn a smirk as she dismantled witnesses, now looked at her client like a man unraveling before her eyes. She had no objections, no strategic interruptions, no well-rehearsed argument, because she knew it too. The evidence was damning. The courtroom doors burst open as a handful of reporters rushed out, already dialing numbers, already writing headlines in their heads. Explosive new evidence in the David Johnson case. Corruption at the highest level? Officer Michael Reeves caught on tape. Reeves' breath came in sharp bursts. He turned to Maya, eyes burning with rage, then to Elijah Small, steady, unwavering. You little bastard, he snarled under his breath. Elijah didn't flinch. The judge's gavel struck hard. Officer Reeves, sit down or I will have you removed from this courtroom. But Reeves wasn't listening. His world was crumbling around him, and for the first time, he knew it. Elijah tilted his chin up, meeting the man's glare head on. You lied, the boy said simply, and now everyone knows. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Reeves had nothing left to say. The courtroom had already witnessed the impossible. A system built to protect its own had been forced to confront the truth. But justice wasn't just about uncovering lies. It wasn't just about proving what had happened. It was about what came next. The verdict was in. The evidence had spoken. Now it was time for judgment. The judge adjusted his glasses, his face impassive as he reviewed the final sentencing papers. The room was deathly still. The only sound was the faint scratching of reporters' pens against notepads, capturing history in real time. Elijah sat next to Maya, his small fingers gripping the armrest of his chair. He had waited for this moment, imagined it in 100 different ways. But now, as it was about to happen, he felt no satisfaction, only a quiet, heavy certainty that the world had finally caught up to what he had known all along. Will the defendant please rise? Michael Reeves stood, his once pristine uniform now replaced with a standard-issue suit. His shoulders were squared, his jaw locked in defiance, but his eyes betrayed him. For the first time, they weren't filled with arrogance. They weren't filled with control. They were filled with the creeping realization that this was the end. The judge cleared his throat. Michael Reeves, you have been found guilty of second-degree murder, conspiracy to falsify evidence, and obstruction of justice. You abused your position of power. You perverted the course of justice. You took an innocent man's life and tried to erase the truth. The judge paused, letting the words sink into the room like iron weights. This court finds no reason for leniency. You are hereby sentenced to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Words hit like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some people clapped, only to be silenced by the judge's gavel. On the left side of the courtroom, members of the community squeezed each other's hands, tears streaming down their faces. On the right, the wall of officers, once so confident, so untouchable, stood in stunned silence. Reeves didn't react at first. He simply stood there, frozen. Then slowly his face twisted into something ugly, something violent. He turned first toward the judge, then toward the prosecution, then finally toward Elijah. You think this is over? His voice was low, shaking with barely restrained fury. You think locking me away changes anything? Elijah didn't flinch. He had stared this man down before. It changes everything, he said. The bailiffs moved in. Reeves struggled, his curses lost beneath the growing noise of the courtroom. But it didn't matter anymore. He was done. As he was dragged away, the courtroom doors burst open, and the next wave of consequences came crashing down. Outside, news cameras flashed. Reporters shouted over one another, desperate to be the first to break the next revelation. Because it wasn't just Reeves. The corruption went deeper. Councilman Frank Porter arrested. Police Chief William Harris arrested. Developers from Westside Development indicted on federal racketeering charges. One by one, the dominoes fell. Maya watched as the officials who had signed off on David's murder were let out in handcuffs. These were men who had shaken hands in the shadows, who had made backroom deals over expensive cigars, who had looked at their community and seen only numbers on a ledger. Now they were nothing more than criminals in cheap suits, paraded in front of flashing cameras. Justice had been slow, but now it was relentless. The city erupted in protest. The people who had once been too afraid to speak now shouted from the rooftops. Their voices no longer whispers of fear, but roars of defiance. And then the final blow came. The development project, the grand plan that had set all of this into motion, was dead. Under public pressure, the city council was forced to suspend all plans for Westside's redevelopment. The land, once marked for demolition, was handed back to the community. The businesses that had been targeted were given restitution. And for the first time in years, the people who had fought so hard to stay knew that they had won. Elijah stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd. His father had fought for this. His father had died for this. And now, standing beside his mother, feeling the weight of history shifting beneath his feet, he knew that David Johnson's legacy would never be erased. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The battle wasn't over. For Maya Johnson, the fight for justice didn't end with Reeves behind bars. It didn't end with corrupt officials taken down or the West Side redevelopment project collapsing under the weight of its own deceit. Justice was not a single moment, it was a war, fought day by day, case by case. She poured every ounce of her grief and fury into something bigger than revenge, a movement. With the same relentless determination that had carried her through her husband's murder trial, she founded the David Johnson Legal Center, a place where families like hers, families who had been trampled by the system, could fight back. The same building that had once housed David's pharmacy, the very place where he had been murdered, now stood as a beacon of justice. The shelves, once lined with medicine, now held case files and legal documents. The counter where David had greeted customers now served as a desk where Maya and her team worked late into the night, preparing lawsuits, exposing corruption, and giving a voice to those who had none. But it wasn't just Maya. Elijah, now older, had become something else entirely. Not just a survivor, not just a boy who had once pointed at a murderer in court. He had become a symbol, the kid with the perfect memory, the boy who had refused to let the truth be buried. His name became synonymous with resistance. His story inspired countless others to come forward, to speak out, to record everything. Cities beyond West Side began to take notice. Investigations launched. More corrupt officers, politicians, and developers found themselves under scrutiny. A single child's testimony had set off a ripple effect, and those in power were scrambling to stay ahead of it. But Elijah wasn't finished. The sun hung low over the cemetery, casting long shadows as he approached his father's grave. The world outside buzzed with the energy of change, but here, everything was still. He knelt, pulling the small golden pharmacist's pin from his pocket, the same one his father had worn every day. The same one David had given him to hold on to remember. With quiet reverence, he placed it atop the smooth granite headstone. "I remember everything, Dad." His voice was steady, but his fingers trembled as they traced the name carved into the stone. "And I kept my promise." His father had told him that truth had power, that remembering was a responsibility, that justice wasn't something given, it was something taken, something fought for, something earned. Elijah had fought, and he had won. The red light on his watch blinked steadily. Recording. It would always be recording, because the fight was never really over, and neither was the truth. If you believe justice must win, like and subscribe. Together we make sure the world never forgets.